All right, Ecclesiastes part 6. We're going to jump into the next chapter this week. Ecclesiastes 4:1. Again, I observed all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them. They have no one to comfort them. All right, here's the big question. Who's responsible for the oppression? Would that be the king? I mean, if he's not directly responsible, I'm pretty sure the buck stops here, as Harry Truman said. And who is it that should bring comfort? And that's another interesting question. When he says they have no one to comfort them, who would bring comfort? And then what kind of comfort are the people looking for? Where do you find it? Because we're in an election year, it is absolutely amazing to listen to the candidates, no matter which party they belong to, and what they're promising and what they see and how much they care for us. And kind of like Solomon, they're very, very good at pointing things out that are wrong. And, oh, I see all this terribleness. And it's like, well, aren't you responsible for that? Oh, no. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge. And so when I ask the question of, what kind of comfort are people looking for? What could the king do to bring comfort? And how would the king not just fix the problem immediately, short term, but actually create something long term? And what do you think happens, by the way, when you realize that you are part of the problem, or perhaps the sole source of the problem, rather than being part of the solution? To me, this is the million-dollar question. Because if you actually realize that you're part of the problem, then you only have two choices. You can continue being part of the problem, or you make a complete turn. When we see the life of Augustine of Hippo, of Saul, who becomes St. Paul, they were confronted with something that was so so against who they were, and they recognized it, that they couldn't stay what they were. They had to change. Incontrovertible. There we go. I knew I'd get it out. And as a result, they find themselves asking the bigger question. If I change, will I still be able to bring comfort? Will I still be able to make a difference? Verse 2, I admire the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive. At funerals, we often comfort ourselves by saying, well, they're in a better place. What do you think we mean by that? When we look at the dead, are we saying that because of the suffering, because of the agony, because of the afflictions, it's better that they are no longer going through that? Or are we saying that they aren't on this earth anymore with all of its pain and suffering, that they have gone to a place where those things can no longer touch them? Because I think there's a double meaning here, which is one of the things that we're really struggling with when we say this. And Solomon says, look, I looked and I admired the dead. And it's interesting when he says that, because he's looking at tombstones, what we would call tombstones. He's looking at the biography of these individuals, and he actually says, they've got it made. St. Augustine said, if you consider the misery of human afflictions, and if you look only at this life, you will think that the dead are more fortunate than the living. And we have to examine that. If this life is all we have, if this is both the means and the end. Verse 3, but better than either of them is the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. One would rather be dead than see such misery and such calamities, unless there is something to make it all worthwhile. Anybody who has children, did you ever bribe your children when they had to have a tooth a cavity filled or they had to get shots, did you ever bribe them by saying, at the end of this shot, at the end of this dentist appointment, there is ice cream? So my daughter, our granddaughter who fell and off a rock and broke her arm when we were going to bury my parents and has a cast on her arm, had to have a tooth extracted the other day. And they went to have the tooth extracted, and the dentist said, oh, we're going to have to put her under anesthesia. So they had to postpone, and then they had to come back. Anyway, so we finally got the picture of Esther after she had gone through the dental appointment. And my daughter's thing was, we're going to get ice cream for this brave girl. And it's an interesting thing how we bribe ourselves. If you get through this, I will give you this. I laugh because when you run a marathon, what do they give you at the end? A banana, some Gatorade, and a piece of metal that you get to hang in your closet and say, I finished a marathon. When you finish college and you've paid them millions of dollars, what do they give you? A piece of paper. Except, by the way, my son, who graduated from the Colorado School of Mines, and his diploma is actually on silver. It's actually a thin pressed silver. The guys who got their bachelor's, it's tin. And I said, ooh, if I get my doctorate, is it gold? But in this, we bribe ourselves. And so Solomon is saying, look, I looked at all this. For those who only believe in Darwin, in evolution, this life being all they get, I want you to think about right now, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is nothing after this life, can you then justify living this life knowing the suffering, the injustice, and all the things that you probably can't do much about? Because that's what we're asking. If this is it, this is all there is, can you justify this life? And if you believe in evolution, then what you say is, if you have learned your lesson, then in 100,000 years, they will have taken care of this and it's no longer going to be a problem. Because evolution, of course, doesn't do anything quickly. So, can we? And I have to admit, I sit there and I look at life and I go, because it also changes. If there is nothing after this world at all for anyone, it changes the way that I would view my life. What would be important? How I would go about living. Verse 4, I saw that all labor and all skillful work is due to a man's jealousy of his friend. This too is futile, in pursuit of the wind. Solomon is bringing up the possibility that everything we do is the result of peer pressure. Someone somewhere, could be a family member, it could be the media, it could be history, is challenging us to do and be something. And so everything we accomplish, everything we set out to be, everything that we try to accomplish is so that we can tell them, I did it. Or I did more than they expected. And so it's not about living a life. It's not about enjoyment. It is about being able to turn to someone and say, nanny, nanny, boo, boo, I beat you. I achieved more than you did. I accomplished this, which means my life has meaning. So, is it easier for a rich person to say this? And is it easier for a rich person to say, everything that people do is just the result of their jealousy of, and people daring them and people, telling them in order for your life to mean something, you have to be able to do this and you have to become this. Is it easier for a rich person to say that? I mean, if you have everything you need, everything you want, is that different than just having enough? And by the way, how do we know what we actually need? Where do we get this thought process that says, if I have this, this, and this, I have all I need? Where do we get that? From who or from what? Because Solomon is saying that the world around us, he didn't understand social media and the internet and TV and commercials, but he said it's about jealousy. Everything we do is about jealousy. We look around at the world and we say, they have this, I should have this. They have that, I should have that. If I want to be considered successful, I have to have this. So where do we find that out? Who gets to set the standard? And when the standard is set, what does it take for people to agree with it and say, yes, we agree, that is successful? In verse 5, it says, the fool folds his arms and consumes his own flesh. This is a really strange verse. But if we go to Proverbs 6, it says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest, and your poverty will come like a robber, your need like a bandit. So Solomon has obviously said this before. He's quoting himself. But the fool folds his arms, consumes his own flesh. Now, why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand? That's Job. The word fool does not mean one who is not smart, but rather one who wastes or misuses their life for no good reason. Elijah took a nap. He had nothing left in the tank. We talked about in the sermon this morning. He'd gone out, he defeated the prophets of Baal. He then runs. Literally it says that he tucked up his cloak and he ran as fast as the horses to Jezebel. And he gets there and she says, if I don't make your life like those of the prophets, may bad things happen to me tomorrow. And Elijah just loses it and goes off and sits under the broom tree and says, I'm going to die. And God says, you need a nap. You need some food, you need some drink. And that was not being slothful, was not Elijah saying, man, if I only did more, or if I could only stay awake longer, or if I could, And this is where we look at it. There's a difference between wasting your life intentionally and replenishing your life. One of the big things that colleges and professors at colleges and universities have enjoyed for years is sabbaticals. They teach X number of years, and then the college or the university says, we're going to allow you to go away for a period of time. We want you to explore. We want you to discover. We want you to write. We want you to be recreated so that theoretically when you come back, you have new things to teach, new experiences to share, and you've replenished yourself physically, emotionally. And we look at that and we go, wow, wouldn't it be neat if we could all take a sabbatical? The question is, what would we do with our sabbatical? So a number of years ago, the head elder of Our Savior said, Mitch, you need a sabbatical. I've applied for one. There's a Pew Foundation, and they give away these sabbaticals. And what they do is they pay for, so that the church can continue to pay me while I go on sabbatical, they pay for the person to come in and cover for me for up to 3 months. Jeff, by the way, whose job was filling out paperwork for the Air Force, filled out this masterful plan, which included all sorts of things that were going to grow me as a pastor, as a person. It was going to be reinvigorating both spiritually as well as knowledge. It was great. He submitted it and it was rejected. He submitted it the second year, it was rejected. He submitted it the third and final time, it was rejected. Now, by the way, what he had, he had me going to Germany to learn about the Reformation. He had me going to other churches to learn about how they do things. He had me going to a place where I could learn more about business skills to help me with my job as a pastor. And they rejected it. And then a buddy of mine who lives in San Diego said, Mitch, I just got my sabbatical approved by the Pew Foundation. And I said, that is awesome. What's your sabbatical going to be like? He said, I'm going to visit every baseball park in America and attend a game. And then he said, by the way, do you know so-and-so? I go, yeah. He says, he just got his approved as well. He's going to go see every show on Broadway. And I looked at that. And I realized that this group that said, we want to help you spiritually, they really just wanted me to go and get away from all things church for 3 months. And if I'd applied to go to all the Disney parks, or if I had simply said, I'm going to visit every beach in California, they probably would have written me a check and said, go. But we made a mistake because we thought, hey, the purpose of the sabbatical is to make me a better pastor when I come back. Not just rested, but with more knowledge and more abilities. Solomon says, if I fold my hands and if I slumber, it's going to be like consuming my own flesh because I'm going to start to rot from the inside. In this case, it is someone who is jealous of others who have things. He's harming himself, and in so doing harms others because of his jealousy. And he's unwilling to work because he just expects these things to be given. He doesn't deserve them, but he expects them nevertheless to be given to him. And that's where this whole consuming his own flesh comes about, because he sets him up in such a way that he can't grow anymore. Verse 6, better one handful with rest than two handfuls with effort and a pursuit to the wind. So which is better, a bird in the hand or two in the bush? And when you ask that question, by the way, what you're really saying is the two in the bush may or may not be able to be caught. But if you've got one in the hand, is it better to eat just one bird, or is it better to take the chance that you could get two birds? Because if you remember, "O brother, where art thou?" where he says, would you like, one of these varmints? And he says, no, it wouldn't even begin to whet my appetite. I'm so hungry that one wouldn't do it, so I will have nothing. This is what Solomon is saying. He says, one handful, it's actually better. Solomon has begun to see this. Verse 7, again, I saw futility under the sun. What is the purpose of this repetition? He keeps saying it over and over again. This is futile. This is futile. This is futile. Is it like the chorus of a song? When I was a kid and all we had was a radio and most of it was AM, when a song would come on that you liked, back then, there was the verse and the chorus. And it only took 2 or 3 times if it was a catchy chorus before you could sing the chorus. You might stumble over the verses for a little while, especially if they were complex. But you knew the chorus. And so if I were to stop right now, the whole Bible study, just say we're done, and I were to hand you all a sheet of paper, and I were to say, what is it that Solomon was saying? Most of you could write down, well, Solomon said everything was futile. You might remember a little bit of some of the other verses, but I think all of you would remember that what Solomon keeps saying is, again, I saw the futility of all that is done under the sun. And he repeats it because it's like his chorus. Verse 8, there is a person without a companion, without even a son or brother. And though there is no end to all his struggles, his eyes are still not content with riches. So who am I struggling for, he asks, and depriving myself from good? This too is futile and a miserable task. When we are working for someone or something, what difference can that make? Can this become a problem if we're always working and then not enjoying our family and friends? Solomon, I hope, is going to get to the point where he can hopefully establish a balance for us. Because if we are offered a job and they say, look, we're going to pay you a ton of money. When I was living in Silicon Valley and I had individuals in the congregation who were working, and this is when they were, the tech was just beginning to explode. Apple had come out with the 2C, and the Mac was just about ready to come out. Microsoft and they'd come out with the 286 processor, and they were just beginning to bridge the 640K RAM so you could actually do more. They now had 16 color monitors. They had 20 megabyte hard drives. There were all this software. It was promised that this was going to be great. And in order to do this, they needed people working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to get ahead of the competition. So the guys in our church would say, Pastor, I know I said I'd help out with the youth group Sunday, but I got to be at work. I go, you got to be at work on Sunday? He says, yeah. He says, here's the thing. He says, if we get this project done, I'm going to get this huge bonus. And they promised me 2 weeks of vacation. I said, oh, that's awesome. They'd get the project done. They'd buy a boat. They'd pull it into the yard and never use it because he said, we got another project. But if I get this project done, I'm going to get a huge bonus and they're going to give me 4 weeks of vacation. And they'd get that project done. And they'd buy something and put it in the driveway and never use it because there was another project. And then one day, by the way, the company would say, sorry, you're fired. We're going through a downsizing. You're fired. And they had a boat, and they had 2 new cars, and they had a nice house, and they had a hot tub. And now they didn't have enough money for the vacation, even though they had all the time in the world while they were trying to scramble to find another job. What is the purpose of our work? Because there's multiple purposes. There is making enough to eat and have a shelter over your head. There's enough to provide for a family if you have a family. But then there's a greater purpose for work. And that is that the work we do actually impacts the community. In other words, what we do should not just be about us, that there should be some sort of overflow that impacts the community. In fact, in such a way that if we do not do our work, the community should not only be the lesser for it, but it should notice it. And this is one of the big questions about the church. If tomorrow we were to close this church, shut it down, somebody were to come in and tear it all down, would anybody other than the people driving by, would anybody drive by and say, what used to be on that corner? Would anybody notice the impact that we had no longer being made? Is there something that we do that people would say, I really miss when our Savior used to whatever? Or if we disappeared, would nobody even notice? And when they built something new, like a new Chick-fil-A on here, they say, I don't know what was there before, but I am certainly glad that this is here now. Verse 9. This is where Solomon begins to get a little bit poetic, and he says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their efforts. So a number of years ago, somebody figured out that the average pastor could take care of a church with 150 people in it. That, depending on the congregation, its age and things like this, but an average pastor could take care of 150 people. And if it got up to like 160, 170, 180, that pastor either had to increase his skills or that pastor was going to have to bring in help because things were going to start to go haywire. But then somebody did another one, and they found out that 2 average pastors in the same congregation could take care of 450 people. Now, this is without any other staff other than a secretary. And people are going, well, wait a minute. An average pastor takes care of 150. Another average pastor who can take care of 150, yet when you put the 2 of them together, they can take care of 450, which is actually what 3 pastors should be able to. And they said yes. And the reason that this became so important was it became about what happens when a congregation is growing. And what we discovered was most congregations back then hit this wall, the ceiling of 150, 160, and that was the end of their growth. Even though there were new houses being built or new people moving into the neighborhood, and they recognized, they said, but there's something wrong with this congregation because it was growing really well and then it just stopped. And that's when they came in and they said, the pastor is no longer able to keep up all the things. So now all the things he's doing is limiting him, and he no longer has the ability to take care of that, which would allow the congregation to grow. So they bring in a new person. And all of a sudden the congregation grows. And then they realize that the next level, so the first one was 100, the second one was around 200, the third one was about 400, and they realized that they kept hitting these ceilings, and that's because the congregation would do what needed, and they would get to this point, and they would say, we just don't understand, we can't grow anymore. And so they came in and they figured this out, and there were all of these growth barriers. So Solomon is saying, yeah, 2 are better than 1 because they actually have a greater amount. And it's interesting because the question is, when we were out here moving all of that sand that I mentioned in the sermon, when I did it by myself, I was able to do this much. When there was 3 of us, I was filling up the buckets, and with 2 people, by the time that the one got over to dump their bucket, the other one was already there. I was filling it, and we were just rotating, and it was amazing how quickly it went. And we moved the sand not 3 times quicker, but probably 5 or 6 times quicker than when I was doing it by myself. The original purpose behind cubicles, when they were originally came out, was simple. They recognized that when people were surrounded by other people, that they were supposed to interact with one another. And in this interaction, they were supposed to inspire one another. So one comes out of his cubicle, goes to the water, and they say, what's the matter? And he goes, I just hit this dead end. The person said, what's the dead end for? He says, I just got this problem I can't figure out. And the other person goes, have you considered this? And he goes, oh, of course. And he goes back and he solves the problem because there's this interaction that's going on in the cubicles. And some of it did work that way. Then came the other problem. One person goes to the water cooler or goes to somebody else's cubicle and says, did you see the game last night? And now we've lost 15 minutes of productive time because they were talking about a game that took place last night. Because there's no barriers, no doors. You can walk in and out of cubicles at will. My son, working for the federal government, got an office with a door. And he said, Dad, it was amazing how much more work I got done because people, when they came to the door, they actually had to think about whether they were going to open the door, step inside, and talk to me or not. When I had a cubicle, they could just go by and say, Micah, blah, 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 blah. But here, they had to consciously make a decision to turn the doorknob and open the door to talk to me. And he says, you would see them, and they would be walking by, and you could see flashing just for a second. No, it's not worth the effort, and they just keep going. He says, my productivity went up. What did teams say that playing games in empty stadiums, why was it different during COVID? When the football players went back to playing, but there was nobody in the stadium. Does anybody remember what they said? They didn't play at their best. Why? Because there were no voices cheering them on. They actually realized that they were getting energy from the fans. And when they got that energy from the fans, it allowed them to take their game from wherever it was at up a couple of notches. Because there is a community effort that actually inspires us. Verse 10, for if either falls, his companion can lift him up. But pity the one who falls without another to lift him up. Introvert, extrovert, the need for someone in our life no matter what. We have a lot of people that are introverts and they go, look, I just really need to be alone. But it's interesting because you will find introverts at places like bowling alleys, movies, concerts. And why will you find introverts at those places with large crowds? Because they're with someone, but they don't have to interact. So they pick up on the community, but they don't have to exert themselves by talking to someone. They don't have to go outside of their comfort zone. Extroverts, on the other hand, you put an extrovert in a place where there's, I can imagine putting an extrovert at like the South Pole where there's only 19 people. And it probably would not go well. Because they thrive on the conversations. They thrive on groups. And when there is no group and when people are working shifts and coming and going, it's very hard on them. But this is the thing. All of us need someone at some point. And when we need someone, we have to have somebody with a phone number that we can call and say, I need you. Because I've fallen and I need help getting up. Verse 11, Also, if two lie down together, they can keep warm, but how can one person alone keep warm? This is simple thermodynamics, but a couple thousand years before the various formulas were given out in science class. But two people together, it just makes sense. Two people, because they're both generating heat, when they put that together, this is one of the things that when we use simple things, we used to be the only air-conditioned Lutheran church in Hawaii. Several others have now joined us in the world of air conditioning. But when we were getting ready to put the air conditioners in, we laughed because people would say, well, why do we need so many air conditioners? And I said, well, the reason is because 2 or 3 times a year, we're going to bring in 300 portable heaters, and we're going to need to be able to offset that heat. And of course, the person looks at me and goes, that's stupid. Why would you bring in 300 portable heaters into the sanctuary? And I'd say, well, they're called humans, and their body temperature is 98.6, which means enough people in a room will eventually raise the temperature up because they're all pushing off this heat. So in order to take that 98.6 and get it down to around 75, we've got a temperature drop of roughly 20 degrees that we're going to have to do, and that requires us to have more BTUs. And then they would get it, because that's the difference. When you put 2 or 3 people, and by the way, I always laugh because you put 2 people in an office and close the door, it's not so bad. You put 10 people in the same office with no windows open and the door closed, and it doesn't take long before it to get hot and stuffy. And you realize thermodynamics work. Verse 12. And if someone overpowers one person, 2 can resist him. Cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Now, this is not about a spiritual life yet. Solomon is giving us some simple scientific rules that we are going to apply later to our life. But here it's simple. It's about the physical life, which eventually impacts our spiritual life. So, Nancy and I, this was our wedding verse, okay? Cord of 3 strands. Now, here's the question. Is that 3rd strand God, which it was for Nancy and I, or just something a rope braider would know? See, a 3-strand rope is 50% stronger than a 2-strand rope. But braiding, when you take the 3 and braid them, it becomes even stronger, because you've not only added an extra cord, but now by weaving them together, you allow them to play off their strengths and hold up the others, and them hold you up. And so when you look at rope, and again, this is Solomon simply pointing out scientific fact. And as people are getting this, he's going to apply it to our life. See, the 3rd strand wraps around the other 2 and allows them to be braided, increasing the ability to withstand force. Jesus always sent out his disciples in 2s. Today, by the way, we don't do 2s so much, we do triads. And so the big thing that was for the last 15, 20 years in churches and things like 12-step groups is triads. And the reason they went with triads is because 2 people, by the way, it's easy for them to lie to one another. It's easy for them to say, I really don't want to deal with this, so I'm just going to say, yes, you look fine, you look marvelous, you're doing good. 3, it's much harder to lie. Because with 2 people, you're only dealing with 2 thoughts. 3, now you've introduced a 3rd, which means it's almost guaranteed that one of the people will not agree with the other 2. And so when Solomon is talking about this, he's saying, we add a 3rd strand. We now have a greater accountability. It means that 3rd strand, that 3rd person, is going to introduce to us things that we may be uncomfortable about, that we may not really want to step forward and handle, but they're not going to let us forget it. One of the hardest things, by the way, in accountability groups and triads is when you're supposed to turn to somebody and say, all right, last week you said you were going to do this. Have you gotten it done? And when the person says, yeah, I'm going to do it today. So today I arrived, sure enough, had a homeless person sleeping down there. I let him sleep an extra 5 minutes, and then I went out and I said, I need you to get up. And he goes, okay. Came back in, finished a bunch of stuff, went back out. He was sitting up. That's as far as he'd gotten. I said, still working on it? He says, yeah. I said, okay. Anyway, by the time I was getting ready to leave to go up to the office, he was standing up. Kayla had come in. Kayla was up in the office for about 5 minutes. She comes down. He's still standing, but he really isn't moving very fast. She was just getting ready to go out, and he was finally packing his stuff. Took him about 15 minutes to go from asleep to packing up his stuff and moving on. The accountability came only because I had to remind him just once. But we've had individuals who have said very impolite things that you normally don't say in church. We've had individuals who have gotten violent on us. We've had individuals who have simply, and we had this lady, by the way, who had earplugs and eye shades. And so when you yelled at her, she just kept sleeping. So you would have to go over very carefully and just tap her foot, because we also don't know what's going to happen when they wake up, because some go kind of crazy. And she pulls out the earplugs and puts up, and as soon as she sees us, she put the blinds back down, put the earplugs back in, and that's when we had to keep pushing, and then we finally had to call the police. When we are going to offer accountability, the accountability is not for our sake, it's for the other person. I don't care whether you choose to do this or not, unless I care about you. And if I care about you, then I want you to take that next step, which is going to allow you to be where you need to go and to do what you need to do. So Solomon says, cord of 3 strands, very important. Verse 13. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. Now, is he talking about himself or someone else? Because sometimes, by the way, we say things and people go, oh, they're being so mean to themselves. Then we go, oh, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about so-and-so. And you go, well, it actually applies to you too. No, it would never apply to me. So is Solomon actually saying this, or is he looking about it? Because here's some of the thing. We got to go down the rabbit hole real quick. So what was it that made David a good king? What is the difference between someone who thinks they deserve or were born to be king and one who the job was thrust upon? David was simply out. Now, David, by the way, had a very high opinion of himself. David thought he was better than everybody else. He and Joseph would have gotten along great. He always thought that he deserved more. But one day the prophet comes out and says, you're going to be king. Now, Joseph, just like David, both of them, because of their thought process, when things like that were told to them, they just said, naturally. So David says, okay, I'm going to be king. But up until that point, whereas he had a high opinion of himself, he probably never thought that he would actually become king. Verse 14, for he came from prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. Now this might be a reference to Joseph or even King David. Remember the appointed time Solomon talked about earlier. He said, everything comes to be not when you want it, not when everybody else wants it, not even if we vote on it, but it happens during the appointed time. And so he says, Solomon and David both, and as well as all the rest of those in the Old Testament, they all became what they were supposed to be, but not until it was the appointed time. Verse 15, I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow a second youth who succeeds him. Here's the story of David and Jonathan. David, who becomes best friends with Jonathan. Jonathan, by the way, is supposed to be the next king, following in his father's footsteps. Now, 1 Kings explains why Solomon, not David's eldest son, succeeds him. Chapter 2 conveys David's last instructions and Solomon's consolidation of his kingdom setting. So when we're reading this, we find out why Solomon was chosen over all the other sons. And here's why. Adonijah should succeed. This is verses 5 to 8. Adonijah is the oldest child. He's the one who should be king. Amnon, Chileab, and Absalom were either dead or missing, meaning Adonijah is now the eldest surviving son. Adonijah enjoyed military, General Joab, and religious Zadok the high priest support. Solomon enjoyed the support of his mother Bathsheba. I hope you see where this is going. Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan persuaded David to support Solomon. Your, Bathsheba's son, Solomon, shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne. Those are in verses 13, 17, and 30. So he doesn't just say it once. He repeats it. Why? Because Bathsheba keeps saying, are you going to make my son the king? And David says yes. In verse 48, David offers a theological interpretation of Solomon's success. He says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who today has granted one of my offspring to sit on my throne. Solomon's succession is seen as God's promise of an eternal dynasty to David that was originally given in 2 Samuel 7:12. This is where God tells David, you are not only going to be king, but you are going to set up a dynasty that will always be seated on the throne. And of course, he's pointing to Jesus. But in the meantime, there will be others of this house and lineage of David that will also sit on the throne, which is why Matthew's gospel, when it starts with going all the way back to David, is so important. 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, we get Solomon's biography of how this came about. The bottom line was a lot of powerful people backed David's other son, Adonijah. And in the end, they were killed or exiled. And a youth was made king. So when Solomon says they were up here and they were following the one who they thought was going to give them everything they wanted, but it wound up somebody else became king. Verse 16, there is no limit to all the people who were before them, yet those who came later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Solomon became king, but that does not mean everyone agreed or that stories about what might have been will not be told around the campfires for generations to come. When you have a choice of who you're going to vote for, who you're going to support, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. One is you simply say, I'm a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, therefore I'm going to vote for those candidates. Another way, you actually analyze all the issues. I agree with this person on this issue and this issue. I agree with this person on this issue. I agree with this person on more issues, therefore I will vote for them. Or, which one is going to benefit me personally? Which one is going to allow me to get a leg up? To have more money, to have a better job, to enjoy a better whatever. And so I'm going to vote for the one who I think is going to bring about me personally better stuff. Remember Luther's quote, if a stone can be lifted and moved, then lift it and move it. But if the stone cannot be lifted, leave it alone. This is not fate, but life will play out and we cannot always control the outcome or the process. And what Solomon is trying to tell us is we all have ideas. We all think how things should go. We all are going to support certain individuals. But he says all things are going to come together in the time they are supposed to according to the will of God. And we need to be careful about getting so wrapped up in a very narrow thought process that when something happens that was not according to our thought process, we don't know how to handle it. And that is where Solomon is going to get to. Next week, when we pick up in the next chapter, where he's going to push us, is beginning to wrap all this up. And we're going to see a bit of a turn for Solomon. And instead of everything being about futility, he's actually going to start guiding us to a place where the futility begins to fade and meaning actually begins to come. All right, go in peace and serve the Lord in gladness. The Lord in gladness.